So spirituality, that term, especially used in this presentation and in much of the literature that we researched, has more to do with the inward self, and I'm going to start sounding a little spiritual here for a minute, so bear with me. It's more of the personal search. It's a way that a person finds greater meaning in their life, and that longing for purpose, that longing for a reason to be here. So it's different than a set of beliefs so much, but they intertwine. One quote that we ran across I thought was interesting. Spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant and the sacred. And it does come into the workplace, because we're becoming, as we'll see as we go on in this presentation, we're becoming people who really want to experience ourselves as whole beings as we go through our day. We don't want to just do it on Saturday or Sunday. We want to experience it as we're performing our jobs, throughout the day. And so it does affect the workplace. Just reading over my notes here. So spirituality would be more the holistic view of how a person wants to express themselves and experience life and experience their purpose. That could even go so far as to inform the type of career a person chooses, and whether they choose to stay in a career for 40 or 50 years or 20 or 30 years, or if they want to move on more quickly. It's going to affect how the person wants to grow in their career. And maybe they just don't feel as fulfilled in what they've been doing for the last 5. And there's something in them that just wants to move on. And so as supervisors, as people that are over other employees, or people that are helping others find jobs, those are just things to keep in mind. Spirituality and religion, they do overlap. They both kind of center on belief somewhere inside. They might bring a sense of comfort to an individual. Many people kind of get a sense of reflection when they think of religion or spirituality, because it is a way of reflecting on our lives and our sense of purpose and our sense of self. Also has to do with, a sense of ethics, a sense of what's right. How can I live well? How can I do what's right for the other person, for myself, for my family? And may include a sense of awe for God, or for a higher power, or for creation, or for whatever the person has that sense of awe for. The differences lie more in that religion would focus more on how a person practices rites, rituals, things that they feel they should follow, maybe what's right and wrong, what's true and false. Spirituality looks more at, where do I find the meaning, as I mentioned before, how do I feel connected with what I'm doing, with other people, and how should I live? So religion focuses more on maybe organizations, and I don't want to oversimplify it here, whereas spirituality focuses more on the individual. So religions kind of influence the individual, and spirituality is, there was a great quote here, and I'm just not reading it right, focuses on how the individual finds a place in the world.
So just to summarize then, how they intersect, religion is more of an organized set of principles or beliefs of a group, whereas spirituality is a set of principles whereby an individual makes sense of the universe.
So now that we've gone back and forth with religion and spirituality, we want to add 2 more. How about ethnicity and culture? Because we just want to be really confused. No. They all intertwine. And you know that, especially attending a conference like this, that ethnicity and culture, it informs our religion, it informs our spirituality, and vice versa. Richard Bonney stated that whether we regard religions and cultural systems or religio-cultural traditions, where does religion end and culture begin? And there really is no strict boundary.
In fact, cultural and religious beliefs are often confused. And why is that? Because many of the world's religions have become enculturated, which is a term you may not have heard very much before. But let me give you an example. And that is in Christianity. Christianity started in Palestine, in the Middle East, about 2,000 years ago. But within a century, it had been transferred to a more Hellenistic or European group of individuals, so much so that after about 100 years, people from Palestine who were adherents to Christian belief sets would not feel at home at all, necessarily culturally, in what had taken place in this church that had become much more of a Gentile cultural tradition. But it is possible for one religion to exist in many cultures. And one really interesting example of that is in Islamabad, Pakistan, where there is a church right now where in the early service it's spoken in English. There are traditional hymns with an organ, and men and women sit next to each other in Western attire. But the next service, men and women sit in separate sections of the church. They dress in their more native attire. The service is conducted in Urdu, the native language of the region, and the hymns are set to music that uses South Asian rhythms with traditional instruments from the area. So two cultures can exist within one religion.
Here's an example of how culture or religion may be influencing the culture. Most women in Afghanistan wear the burqa, but it may be more to do with the local customs than it is their religious requirement. And this is how culture is being influenced by the religion of the culture.
So it might help us at this point to back off just a little bit, because there is such an intersection between religious beliefs, spirituality, ethnicity, and culture. And what we're going to go into as we move through this presentation is to try and give us an understanding that we may encounter someone who dresses, acts, speaks, does things differently than we do, and we might assume that is a cultural difference. We might assume that's a religious difference, and oftentimes these different things are confused. But let us look a little bit at the a big difference that we will see between people of more of a Western cultural mindset and an Eastern cultural mindset. In Western cultures, individualism is a primary motivator, whereas in Eastern cultures, collectivism is more important. In the Western culture, there is a strong sense of self, whereas in Eastern cultures, the sense of self is less important. In the West, there is a weak sense of interdependence, or we might say a strong sense of independence. Certainly here in Oregon, we experience that. Whereas in the East, there is a strong sense of interdependence and community. In the Western culture, we tend to take more of an analytical approach, just break down the problem and solve it. Whereas in Eastern cultures, there's much more of a holistic approach. How does what I'm doing affect the culture as a whole, the community as a whole? The West tends to view a universal God, whereas the East tends to view universal truth. And in Western cultures, the foreground takes the visual attention. What am I doing right now? What's right in front of me? Whereas in Eastern cultures, the background is more important. How does what I'm doing and where I am affect the entire community?
So why is all of this important? And I want to just step for a minute to the side with this little disclaimer that we realize as we go through the differences between Eastern and Western culture. And as we're going to look in a few minutes at some different cultures individually, we are doing this flyby. We may get things wrong. You know, we were researching this and we took what we found. Things may have changed since the research articles were written. So, you know, and we are aware of the fact that this is not the way it is down the line. But the whole idea here is to get a feel for how interconnected religion, spirituality, ethnicity, culture can be, and how we don't really know where our differences are coming from. In the end, we'll actually pull this together, I promise. One point we want to be aware of is that humans are cognitively biased with respect to their preferred beliefs. I had a personal experience in one of my training seminars this last year. I was in a training seminar. I can't remember the name of it, but we were asked to do a pretty in-depth interview with each other, and it was actually about spiritual matters. During the break, I had briefly said hello to a student that I hadn't met before of an Asian culture. And I could tell right away that we were going to have a little bit of a language barrier because English was just a little bit halting for her. She was very good at it, but I thought, I was trying to be sensitive to that. The break was short. We went back to class. Then we were asked to engage in this activity for, it was going to be like about an hour and a half, together with another student, just, break out, how you do that. And we were going to ask each other these really deep questions about our family history, about our religion. And I don't know why, but I was across the room from this woman. The room was filled with probably 35 people, and she caught my eye. She was sitting next to a man. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me, oh my goodness, she probably is, I think I had seen a ring. She's probably married. She probably cannot do this exercise with a man. And she looked at me, we had barely met. And she just made this frantic, motion, let's do this together. Well, my instructor was also of Asian descent, so I turned to him quickly and I said, I think there's going to be a tad bit of a language barrier. Do you have any suggestions? He said, just go slow. So we're walking to a place. I let her choose the place because I was trying to be culturally sensitive and know that these were personal things she was going to be sharing, and wanting and kind of thinking to myself, okay, how do I do this as a counselor, as a person? How do I do this so that I don't encroach on her sensitivities, on her personal space? This will be a good activity for me, a good way to practice some of my skills. She chose a very private space in a chapel area of the university. So we sat down together, and thankfully I remembered one of the details that we're going to mention a little later. Thankfully, right before I started interviewing her, I remembered that eye contact was not considered something that would be respectful. So I thought, okay, this is going to be a challenge, because for counselors, eye contact is huge. For counselors, body language and all the nonverbals, it's huge, and we go on that, and without eye contact, we kind of can't make that connection, and then we don't know where to go with our questions. Now you know how to fool your counselors. So, I was so glad I remembered that. We started the interview, and sure enough, she would hear the question, and then she would look up, and she would answer the question as if she were reciting something. So I had to take a deep breath. I had to, again, remind myself, this is respectful for her. So I tried to give her that space, and I wrote, and we were supposed to write, which isn't really a very, staring down is not a counselor thing to do, but we were supposed to be writing the answers, and wrote the answers. I thought, I wonder how she's experiencing this whole thing. For me, it's quite interesting, because I felt no connection. I could have been just completely thrown off my game if I hadn't, thought of these cultural things quickly. Afterwards, we had about an hour or two later, we had sort of a time to discuss what it had been like for each other. So we sat down at a more casual setting, and we just talked about what it was like. She actually was very impacted by the whole experience, as was I. And I was surprised at the things that she had taken in. So if we can't get waylaid by the different cultural differences, connection can still be made. Anyway.
So one of the things that this slide shows us right here is that without having some understanding, without having somewhat of a broader context and an embracing of the different cultural and belief systems and how those are expressed in a person's life, we will default back to our preferred belief set. And that comes to bear when it comes to working with those of other faiths. And just to give you a little bit of disclosure, so I have a preferred belief system that I have to come with wherever I am. The church that we pastor is of a denomination called Calvary Chapel. It's an evangelical Christian group. And this has been, since I was about 17 years old, been my belief set. So that's fine. That's where my view of the world comes. And I need to know what I believe, so then I can appreciate what other people believe. And I don't let that be, oh, well, you don't believe the same way that I do. And that becomes a barrier. And in fact, a little bit later in our conversation this morning, we are going to talk about a continuum where we naturally start at one end, but hopefully get to the other end where we can truly appreciate and become curious about and actually embrace in a way that says, I value you as a person. It doesn't mean you have to believe the way that they do. And I think oftentimes we feel threatened by someone with a different belief set than ours that, oh, you're going to try and evangelize me. Well, that's not what it's about at all. Being in a customer setting or a coworker setting with those of a different religion can really be a very enriching experience, but it doesn't have to involve debates and am I better than you and I've got to prove that my system's better than yours. So let's talk about working with those of other faiths. And you may have noticed on these slides in the different sections I've put up little icons that represent various different religious belief systems. And your challenge is how many of them can you recognize? So let's start out with the law, because state law actually does prohibit discrimination on the basis of religious affiliation. And even further than that, the law also prohibits, and I love how the law puts it, of course, it's Oregon state law, right? It prohibits the prohibition of certain religious practices. Why is this important for us as we are working with people of different belief systems? Because there are rules that govern the accommodation of religious practices in the workplace. Here's a great example. This man here in this slide is a Muslim man. He is in his office, and as we mentioned to you before, many Muslims pray 5 times a day. Here he has his prayer rug out and he is engaging in a religious practice. Now, we might be walking by this guy's office, maybe he's our supervisor, maybe he works for us, and we think, what is he doing? He's staring out the window, he's standing on a rug, he's on his knees, he's bending his head over. You know, is he sick? Is he goofing off? What's happening? Giving ourselves a better understanding of different practices and the laws that allow those practices to take place in the workplace gives us, we just step right beyond that. Oh, it must be one of his times of prayer. Oregon law makes accommodation for these religious practices, so we're all good, no problem. And then we can move on to actual interaction and we get beyond that kind of stereotypical response that we might have. So the accommodation law addresses 3 different areas: dress, time off, and duties. And the rule that governs this says that an employer must reasonably accommodate an employee or applicant's religious belief, observance, or practice unless the employer can demonstrate that such accommodation, and here's the key, of course it takes a million years to get to the important part, right? That's a typical Oregon rule, and I can say that because I'm a state employee. But whether it would cause undue hardship on the employer's business. That's a pretty tough standard to meet. So by and large, unless it's causing an undue hardship, employers in Oregon need to accommodate the religious practices of their employees, and thus we need to as co-workers in terms of dress, time off, and duties.
So to summarize, why should we be concerned? Well, because we're going to be encountering people who dress, act, or speak differently in the workplace and in other places. And instead of jumping to conclusions, we need to take possible faith or cultural differences into account. So different cultures have different mindsets. Culture gathers all the aspects of one's life, including religion, spirituality, and spirituality that give persons meaning, significance, and grounding in who they are and how they choose to live. Just because someone belongs to an ethnic group doesn't mean that they will adhere to all the characteristics of that group. I think we've touched on that a little bit. Another example of that would be just because a person is part of a religious group doesn't mean that they adhere to all of the practices of a religious group. In Christianity, for example, we're sort of a culture and a religion at times for different people, depending on how much they have incorporated their belief system into their way of life. And that is sort of a continuum in and of itself. For some people, they choose to become Christian or any other faith because they were raised in it. Perhaps it's a good social experience for them to have. It's a community for them. Some people go so far as to want to experience that community so that they can further their businesses, or they can have contacts with people that they're familiar with, comfortable with. It's a social setting. And the continuum then goes on from there all the way to a belief system or a cultural set of experiences and practices being a real part of a person's life so deeply that every decision that they make is affected by that belief system. That's why we really, when we meet someone, when we know someone, we can't assume that because they're part of any group that they're going to believe one thing or another, or they're going to act in one way or another.
So, now I'm going to talk about, I used the word inculturation a few minutes ago, which is really how a religion changes based upon the culture, but now I want to talk about acculturation, which is how the individual changes based upon what culture they came from and what culture they go to. And this really dovetails with what Margaret was just saying, because we will encounter people who are at different levels of acculturation, and that will influence how they express themselves in the workplace and in everyday life. And so let's talk about that. Why are some more or less acculturated? And this is kind of a continuum. And none of this is right or wrong, good or bad, or anything like that. It just is what it is. Those who are less acculturated may be new immigrants into a different culture. They tend to rely more on the beliefs and practices of the culture that they came from and their ancestors, or their culture or their religion of their heritage. As people become more acculturated, what we find is that they tend to cast off those cultural and religious belief systems and heritages, and they tend to glom onto the cultural norms of the culture in which they are living. But then there's another level beyond that, and that is being bicultural, where you are more comfortable with the ways that both cultures exist. A couple of interesting pieces of information about that. If a person is more educated and upwardly mobile, they tend to be more acculturated. In other words, they dissociate themselves from the ethnic group of their origin. Again, doesn't mean right or wrong, good or bad. It's just something to observe, just something to put into our minds as we encounter people of different belief systems.
So this next set of slides is kind of that overview that I was alluding to earlier. We're not claiming to know everything about every culture. A lot of this you already know. In fact, a lot of what we've already explained, you probably already know. But the reason we're putting it together in this room, thinking about religion in the workplace, is because that awareness needs to just be in the forefront of our minds as we think about interacting with people from different religious backgrounds. So for example, we're just going to kind of fly by different cultures. European Anglo-Saxon Americans tend to have a very dominant value of rugged individualism. That is one of the traits that does tend to really set, Americans in general apart. They tend to be open conflict avoidant, value hard work. very future-oriented. So sometimes being in the present isn't as important as how is this going to get me to where I'm going. Religion and spirituality is actually highly valued, as is religious diversity. And ethnic origin doesn't tend to influence faith.
For African American culture, there is a common bond through unique history or African ethnicity. Survival is a central value. There is a strong sense of communalism, a high value on work and educational achievement. Spirituality and identity are actually inseparable, and spirituality is integrated into most aspects of life. And then I found this interesting, that music is a universal theme of Black spirituality.
For Latinos, Latinas, there is tremendous diversity because it actually encompasses many, many groups of people, including Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban. Each has a different set of values and religious and spiritual practices. Family, though, is a shared value. It supersedes the individual desire. Respect for authority is a strong value. Roman Catholicism is a vital religious force for almost all Latinos, so it's kind of an undergirding belief set. And devotional materials are often prominently displayed. So you might see different icons or books on a person's desk or in their office.
Just helps us to understand a little bit why some things are happening. For Asian Americans, collectivism is highly valued. Individuals are seen as the product of many generations. There is a wide variety of religious backgrounds, including Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And missionary efforts do reflect the current religious affiliation of Asian Americans. Over the centuries, there's been a lot of missionary activity in Asian countries, and so you can see that over half of Asian Americans are either Protestant, Christian, or Catholic.
For Native American culture, there is also a tremendous amount of diversity because when you think of over 500 tribes and languages, definitely can't lump everybody in the same place. Family and tribe unit are very strong in community. Listening and quietness is valued as a communication tool. And I had to stop and think about this when I read through this. And what is listening and quietness? You know, kind of like my Asian friend, although she was looking up, if a person just sits there quietly in front of you and doesn't really make any type of a facial expression, you might feel like, oh my goodness, you know. So knowing that is helpful. Community and sharing is highly valued, back to the tribal system and family. There's a sense of sacred in all of life. Harmonious relationships are important. That's a kind of a special value to be aware of because that can help you in relational experiences. And there's a mixed history with Christian missionary activities in the past, which I think we can all kind of figure out why.
Okay. So taking all of this education, I know we've been throwing a lot of stuff at you, but I hope a few things stick here and there to give you a broader understanding of the differences that religious belief systems, ethnicity, and culture can have on people's expression in the workplace, and how having a broader understanding of that can actually help us to serve people and work with people in a more meaningful way. So how do we go about doing that? When the rubber meets the road, how does that actually happen? So let's talk about this idea of communication with curiosity rather than value judgment. First of all, we should probably define some terms. For instance, what is curiosity? And I really like this definition when it comes to working with others of different religious belief sets. It's an adjective. It means eager to learn, understand, or know, to be inquisitive, arousing or exciting speculation, interest or attention through being different or unknown, an inquiring, open mind, interested and seeking to know and understand, to wonder. Curiosity often involves not just asking questions, but also active listening. And Maya Bailey put it this way: it's remaining an open, blank slate without making assumptions.
those definitions, those expressions are so helpful. How do we communicate curiosity? How do we communicate openness to other people? In counseling, we call it having a not knowing stance with our clients. Everything that we've just told you, even if you took all of these slides and even if every single detail was absolutely precise and correct, and you memorized it all, from what we've just said, it wouldn't really matter because you can't necessarily pigeonhole anybody into any group anyway. So I guess the point is we don't know. So when we come to other people, we come with this open curiosity of, I really don't know anything about your history, about your traditions, who you are, what you value. As counselors, it helps us. You know, we've come a long way from the Freudian idea of a counselor sitting there and being the professional who tells you what to do. And we've also come a long way in the workplace, from people just going to their workaday job and sitting there for 8 hours and getting it done and then leaving. People want to be valued as a human being more. And like I said earlier, they actually want to feel a little bit more like a whole person in their experience of working. So in our interactions with clients and with coworkers, how can we help that be a part of our experiences? And again, like we mentioned at the beginning, we're not suggesting that you try to encourage, religious conversations or anything. But at the same time, you're interacting with each other all of the time. So how do you do this? You realize that they're the expert on their life. They know their experience. And this is really great, by the way, just for interpersonal communications. It's also great with your kids. I mean, especially the older they get. If you go at communicating with the idea that, what are you experiencing? What are you wanting to tell me? Not, oh yeah, I met a Latino, 5 years ago, and I know all about them. Or I knew a Muslim, and so then you must be like them. That is a tendency we have. We want people to think we know them. So we quickly throw in all the stuff that we know about that ethnicity or that religious belief system. And we may be very, very off base, which is one of the reasons why we've gone through all of this today with you. So that active listening that Tom mentioned, it looks kind of like reflective statements, such as, what is this like for you? How does your family find time to do the things that matter to you? Or tell me about that. Or how do you experience that, or what was that like this weekend when you did this or that with your family? Statements that draw out what they're going through, what matters to them. And I guess most importantly, I would want to say, staying fully present is kind of a key. We can be distracted by many things, especially in the workplace, especially not wanting to be distracted by our own preconceived ideas of what this person is probably trying to tell us. So if we can just do that one thing and just stay right there with them, it's going to take us a long way.
So we're going to talk about showing that curiosity without value judgment in two different ways. The first is through nonverbal openness. And I don't know exactly what this woman was feeling when this picture was taken, but I just thought it was a great picture of what we can express without ever saying a word. In college, my background is in communication studies. And there are a lot of figures thrown around about how much of communication is actually the words that are spoken and how much simply consists of the expressions on our faces and how we hold ourselves and the things that we do. And I've read a lot of studies about that, and then a lot of others that have debunked those studies. It's kind of like coffee, You get one study that says coffee is horrible for you, and then the next day one comes out that says coffee will save your life. So I tend to believe the latter ones, just so you know. My belief system is strongly in favor of coffee consumption. At this point, probably the best number that I can give you is that about 60% of the communication stream between two people involves no words at all, but simply involves other things. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because you will, I mean, we talked about how we're biased toward our preferred belief set. Unless you're aware of some of these nonverbal cues, you may have someone that sits down next to you that you know is from a different religious belief system. And the expressions on your face can actually communicate a lot to them right off the bat. And we don't want to make you feel all self-conscious and, oh no, I'm going to make them feel bad. But if you're aware of how these things can affect your communication, it can really benefit you. So
first, we think about first impressions. This is a little bit shocking, but one study showed that students who had a positive impression of a professor after just 2 seconds of meeting them did better in the class. So especially if you're a supervisor or if you're trying to have a good working relationship with somebody in your department or your agency, that openness that you might show in the first few seconds, few minutes of relating to this person could make a difference between the success of that working relationship, the success of that employee, or not.
Let's talk about posture. The difference between having an open posture that is welcoming or having a posture that's very closed and has this feeling of, do you really want to talk to me? I don't really want to talk to you.
Or I know everything. That's kind of what that lady looked like to me. I just know it all. Gestures and expressions. One study found that we can recognize, this is unconsciously, we are recognizing over 250,000 facial expressions. Our faces say so much. I was talking with a friend a couple of days ago, and she was asking me some advice for her kids, and I'm trying to put on the counselor hat, and again, the whole eye contact and the facial expression thing came in, and her face turned into this funny contortion. I had to stop her. She has a tendency to do this. She's a really good friend. And I said, are you okay? Is this sounding okay to you? And she said, oh yeah, go on. But those facial expressions, they say a lot.
Then there's the idea of engagement, which we've touched on a little bit, and it can vary culturally. Generally in the West, eye contact and the sense of I'm engaged in this conversation is really important. If, for instance, you're sitting down in the break room with somebody who's from a different religion and you're staring out the window, they're going to get the clue right away that you don't really care about the conversation. But if you're with them, making eye contact, if that's culturally appropriate for you, and show in your expressions that you're interested, it really goes a really long way.
Proxemics, physical space, that's something that I have to think about a lot when I'm in the room with clients. I met with a couple last night, and where I put my chair in between them matters. If I put my chair a little bit too close to one, then that means I'm aligning with her. If I put my chair too close to him, then that means I'm aligning with him. And then, at one point, he has a lot of physical pain, and so he pulled his chair back, and immediately I thought, oh, am I in his personal space? So I kind of backed up a little bit. Being sensitive to the other person and what their cultural norms might be for that personal space, just what they seem to feel comfortable with is helpful.
And one of the interesting things about the differences between cultures is what we call haptics or touch. And for instance, in some Middle Eastern cultures, in some European cultures, the idea of personal space and touch is much closer than a lot of Americans are used to. So, for instance, you'll see men kissing each other in other cultures, and that's just a form of greeting. It's a completely natural thing. You'll see guys hugging each other, and here in America, we're manly men, right? We don't hug. Real men don't hug, right? But it is important to understand that that communicates something to the person that you are speaking with.
And then again, we want to mention that different faiths and cultures do interpret nonverbal cues differently. So just because we interpret them one way doesn't mean that it's the only way they can be interpreted. And again, this is not hard and fast, we've got it all figured out. When we say that Arab and Iranian people are more verbally expressive, we're not trying to pigeonhole this ethnic group. But they do tend to be more verbally expressive than, say, an Asian culture. I mean, there's a real difference that we can see pretty much across the board. Greeks I didn't know this, but they use a downward nod for agreement and an upward one for disagreement. I used to work with a Greek professor, and I'm sitting here, I read that, I thought, did he do more of this or more of this, you know? Really threw me. Hand gestures, I think we know, can vary widely by culture. We want to be very aware, especially if we're in a different country. Showing of joy, this was another one that I had never thought of. It's more likely to be expressed in an individualistic culture because it stresses uniqueness, and it might disrupt interdependence in a more collectivist culture. I never thought of that. That was very eye-opening. I mean, we a lot of us, I know in our culture, you know, expressing joy is this thing that we're supposed to do all the time. Just because someone doesn't mean they don't have joy. It's just not maybe culturally appropriate for them to express it. Eye contact, we already mentioned. It can be interpreted as attentiveness in the West, but Hispanic, Asian, and Middle Eastern cultures see eye contact as more rude or disrespectful. And personal space is much closer in Latin America and the Middle East than it is here in America. Also, verbal openness. How do we, I mean, I already touched on this, how do we communicate verbal openness and curiosity? We talked a little bit about open-ended questions a minute ago. We want to use the words why, what, how, those types of questions. I mean, we don't want to use the word why. Yeah, Tom wrote this slide, and it's fouled me up every time.
Sorry about that.
Why don't we want to use the word why? Stop and think for a minute about from the time you were a kid up until now, anytime somebody says, well, why? Why do you do that? Why do you believe this? Why do you practice that? You immediately feel like, you kind of feel a little judged. So we want to throw out the word why. But using words more like how or what are helpful, like how does that impact you and your family, I mentioned earlier, or when do you find time to do those things that matter to you? Like I said before, tell me more about that. How do you experience that? That's one of those phrases, you know, how counselors used to say, and how does that make you feel? Well, now we're trained to say, and what is that, how do you experience that? What's that like for you? Because that got so overused. So now we're overusing, how do you experience that? It's crazy. Anyway, overall, you want to seek information and understanding rather than opinion.
So I want to pause here just for a moment and share a personal experience that I had. And in my role as a pastor at Calvary Chapel Church, we teach through the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so I spend a lot of time teaching through the Old Testament, which many of you probably know focuses more on the nation of Israel and Judaism. And I ended up having a great curiosity about those who adhere to a Jewish belief system. And I had the opportunity to work with someone who was a Jew, and because I had this curiosity through teaching through Old Testament books, I found myself very curious about what it is that they felt and did, and how did they experience that. And what it became was a very rich experience for me, just learning more about what they experienced in their religious belief system. So it is definitely possible. Now, I want to, at this point, talk about our society. We've come a lot of it from an individual point of view, but there's a continuum in society of how we have treated those of different religious belief systems, different cultures, different ethnicity, and different language groups. And as we go through these, I think that you're going to see in America how we have gone from what is thought of as more of a destructive sort of cultural mindset to one that is more proficient and actually even encouraging of biculturalism. So let's talk about cultural destructiveness. Cultural destructiveness makes people fit the same cultural pattern. It excludes those who don't fit. In other words, forced assimilation. I think back to when we first settled this country as Europeans, and we forced Native Americans to adhere to the Western European culture. And I've written several books, and one of them is called Oregon at Work, and it's about the employment history of the state from 1859 through 2009. And one of the things that I had to research about that was the forced assimilation of all of the Native American tribes here in the state of Oregon, where people were rounded up, forced to walk all the way across the state. They were resettled in the Grand Ronde area and forced to take on clothing, agricultural and employment activities that were based upon Western European culture rather than on the Native American culture. So we have, of course, come a long way, but it has taken a long time. So cultural incapacity supports segregation as a desirable policy, enforces racial policies, and maintains stereotypes. It maintains a paternalistic posture toward lesser races. For example, discriminatory hiring practices, lower expectations of minority clients, and subtle messages that they are not valued. It discriminates based on whether members of diverse groups know their place. Are any of these phrases kind of ringing any bells? I don't know if any of you saw the film that's out right now called The Butler. Have any of you seen that? Very, very well done. And I grew up in the 1960s and 70s when a lot of the African American civil rights movement was taking place. And so I really feel this fits the bill for what we were like as a country. The next level is cultural blindness. And that's the belief that color and culture make no difference, that basically all people are the same. But it ignores the strengths of those of other cultures and continues to encourage assimilation. And it isolates those who do not assimilate, blames victims for their problems, and views ethnic minorities as culturally deprived. The next stage is called cultural pre-competence. And it desires to deliver quality services, has commitment to civil rights. I think this is where we really saw our country in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s. There were attempts to improve some aspect of services to minority groups. But it often lacks only information on possibilities and how to proceed. We really don't know where to go. Many believe that accomplishment of one goal or activity fulfills obligations. So you make a token response, and that fulfills what you need to do. The next stage, though, and I think this is an exciting one because it's where we are moving as a nation, and I hope as individuals as well, and that is cultural competence, which shows acceptance of and respect for differences, expands cultural knowledge and resources, provides continual self-assessment. How am I doing in my reactions to those who are different cultures than mine? Pays attention to the dynamics of differences, and adapts service models to needs. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. How can you, as a person working with customers, how can you adapt maybe your nonverbal and verbal skills to help serve a person who is expressing their differences of religious belief or cultural? But then there's a further stage, and the last stage is called cultural proficiency, which holds all cultures in high esteem and seeks to add to their knowledge base, excuse me, and advocates for continuous cultural competence.
And certainly that's what we are going toward with conferences like this, trying to increase our cultural competence. To come back to a point that we mentioned earlier and to camp on it a little bit more and add to it, your faith and your culture are going to color how you see other people. Now, when I first started my education toward counseling, I'm a pastor's wife. I thought, oh no, are they going to make me set aside everything that I believe? Is that what I'm supposed to do? Am I going to do I need to become a person, if I'm going to accept others, a person who basically doesn't have a belief set? How's that going to work? I mean, that wasn't going to work, obviously. Much to my surprise, it was actually the opposite. And that's what I want to share with you right now. The more we are aware of our own belief set and our cultural norms, the better we are able to accept others. I know it seems kind of odd, but think about when we were teenagers and we were kind of trying on a bunch of different belief sets, and we might have been going away from our parents over here and trying this thing on, or going away from our peers over there, or joining them over here. anytime anybody, especially our parents, asked us questions, we immediately started to feel like, wait a minute, you're going to try to change me. And we're kind of that way when it comes to our belief sets, our religious beliefs, our cultural beliefs. If we don't know them well, if we haven't matured them in our own minds, if we haven't become really understanding of ourselves, have insight into ourselves, then we can't possibly be open to the beliefs of other people. So it's when we're sure of what we actually believe that we can tend to feel more accepting of others. Does that kind of make sense? We need to be more self-aware, not less. And that helped me in my field of choice because, and it's true, when I'm sitting with someone who's from a different belief system, my job is to not try to sway them to any other type of belief system, but to help them explore how that is impacting their lives. So in order to do that, I can't feel threatened. They'll see it. They'll see it on my face. They'll see it in my body language. So in order to do that, I just have to feel more and more confident in what I believe. So we encourage you to become familiar. And if you feel like I have no religion, I have no belief set, or you know people like that, it still is a belief set to have no religion. So feel confident in that and explore that and discover more why you feel that way.
So I wanted to, as we're nearing the end of this portion of it, I wanted to bring to you a guy by the name of Milton Bennett wrote a developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And I really like what he had to say, because I think if we can kind of pull that into our mind as we're working with people of different religious belief sets and cultures and ethnicities, it can help us to have that curiosity without value judgment. And this is the skill, to be able to shift perspective. You know, you've seen movies, right, where you have the person is talking and the camera's over their shoulder, and then suddenly the other person starts talking and the camera shifts to the other side. That's a change in perspective, and that's what Bennett is really talking about. Being able to shift perspective while still maintaining our commitments to our own values. So you're not giving up who you are in order to shift perspective. The task in this stage is to understand that the same behavior can have different meanings in different cultures. And our point here is try to listen from the speaker's point of view. So in summary, our job is to provide service and to help our clients obtain meaningful access. In my work at the Employment Department, I oversee the Limited English Proficiency Program, and this idea of meaningful access is very important in that program. We want to make sure that people who don't speak English well can still have a meaningful experience with our agency, and that's really what it's about with working with coworkers and customers, providing them a meaningful access to services.
And the idea that we can help clients and coworkers overcome barriers and misunderstandings that might arise because of faith differences. We can help in that.
And then finally, we can also have really meaningful relationships with those coworkers who are of a different religion if we have that openness and that curiosity. We've got a few resources for you, and actually, if you want to leave a card for me afterwards, I can email you this PowerPoint presentation, and there are some great resources for you if you want to read more, if you're interested in some of the background material that we presented here this morning.